Good morning, Matt.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. I'm Sarah Posner. I'm senior editor at Religion Dispatches, and I'm here this morning with Matt Anderson, who is the lead writer at the blog Mere Orthodoxy and the author of the book Earthen Vessels, which is a theology of the body for evangelicals. And we're going to talk today about the question of, is Christianity in crisis? And this was prompted by Andrew Sullivan's cover story in Newsweek during Holy Week, which was titled Christianity in Crisis, which provoked a great deal of discussion and I think perhaps angst for some people. And I'll just say up front that I don't have, not being Christian, I'm Jewish, so I don't really have a personal dog in the fight, so to speak, but it's a professional interest of mine. And I think for Matt, you have more of a personal interest in it, being
I'm an evangelical. You can say it's all right. It's all right.
I was actually trying to figure out the way to describe your profession. You're a blogger, you're a writer, you're an educator, and you're an evangelical, right? So I'll just say up front that I thought that his essay was a little bit, dare I say it, mundane. I actually didn't think that he probed the things that I would have probed if I were writing such a piece. But of course, he's a devout Catholic, and so I think he has a different stake in it than I do, obviously, and perhaps has a different stake in it than you do.
Yeah.
But I know that you engaged in a sort of Twitter. I know you blogged about it, and you engaged in a Twitter discussion about it that took place last week.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you could summarize maybe your own take on it and what it was that you took issue with.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I totally agree with you. It doesn't seem like there's anything terribly original about the complaints. I have a tough time seeing it as anything more than the sort of standard theological liberalism that mainline Protestants have been sort of arguing for the past 30, 40 years. And so from that standpoint, I was a bit surprised at the reaction. Obviously it's Andrew Sullivan and it's a cover story in Newsweek, and so it gets all sorts of attention from that standpoint just by default.
Right, which it was obviously intended to do.
Yeah, and it's as my friend Fred Sanders pointed out, it's Newsweek's sort of annual Easter story, rile up all the Christians, get a lot of page views.
I saw that Sanders said that, but I was trying to think of other examples of Easter Newsweeks, and I couldn't think of any. But maybe I was not just paying close attention to.
Yeah, well, I think it may not be Newsweek directly. It seems like the weeklies every couple of years at least. There was a story a couple of years ago about. Did the resurrection really happen? I think sort of put forward the sort of counter reading, untraditional reading of the resurrection. So it seems like at least every 2 or 3 years they have these religious stories that. But conservative Christians, we're good at finding ways of disagreeing with just about everything that comes out of those sorts of magazines. So it's pretty easy, actually, if there's a story that has to do with Christianity around Easter time, to read it in that way. But yeah, with Sullivan's piece, I think there's the sort of tacit anti-doctrine line all the way through, or maybe even maybe it's even explicit, but it's certainly there. Definitely a tacit sort of St. Paul never gets mentioned in the piece, and that's not surprising given everything that Sullivan says about the real Christianity. So there's almost a sort of Well,
he focuses more on St. Francis.
Yeah.
Which is sort of interesting. I mean, because he is, I actually thought, this is going to sound perhaps odd for me to say this, but I thought the piece read as written by somebody who doesn't really understand American evangelicalism. Because I kind of felt like he zeroed in on St. Francis, which is fine. I mean, it's not like St. Francis is an inconsequential figure in the history of Christianity.
Right.
And so I thought that was fine, but he kind of counterposes it to, he describes this as many suburban evangelicals embrace a gospel of prosperity, and then others defend a rigid biblical literalism. And so he kind of gives, and then still others think the earth is 6,000 years old, and he kind of gives a laundry list that in some circumstances could fit into one person. I mean, there are people who would embrace, or whose theology embraces all of those categories. And I kind of felt like I didn't think it reflected a good overview of the wide array of beliefs that one evangelical could have. Or, on the other hand, and when I say wide array of beliefs, I'm talking about that paragraph where he lists these different things that evangelicals do believe. Or that within evangelicalism, there are some things that he talked about that are within evangelicalism very controversial, like the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, and I would say, much of the energy within evangelicalism the last decade has been a sort of anti-prosperity gospel type approach. And so you're absolutely right.
Even though there still is a lot of money and energy in the prosperity gospel. Yeah,
and huge demographic there. But the counterinsurgence is very strong. But, it's interesting. I think that's a really interesting point. I would say evangelicalism. It had one of the main facets of evangelicalism has been this sort of purism, where there's a large subsect of evangelicals who are borderline anti-Trinitarian or outright anti-Trinitarian. They have deep suspicion about creedal statements and church authority, and they have this sort of strip it back, get it at least to the first century. And so there's a lot about Sullivan's piece that I think resonates with a large swath of evangelicals who are, would share many of his sort of intuitions and his impulses about where things have gone wrong, even if they might...
About materialism and consumerism.
Yeah. About materialism and consumerism, but also the sort of politicization of the faith and this sort of wariness about Christianity as a dogmatic system that is authoritarian and repressive and those sorts of things.
So who would you put in that category? Would you put somebody like Shane Claiborne in that category? Is there somebody else that you're thinking of?
No, not so much Shane Claiborne. They tend to be more fringe than Claiborne is. Claiborne is, seems to want the whole New Testament isn't dividing Paul and Jesus amongst themselves. Names that come to mind, I don't know, are familiar to most Americans, and it's fringe, and it's definitely a fringe movement, but it's there, and it feeds this sort of suspicion towards contemporary institutions, which is why for a lot of evangelicals, you have this sort of, we're always perpetually reinventing ourselves, and so the emerging church movement over the past decade is this reaction against conservative evangelicalism. Within the emerging church movement, you have a conservative emerging church movement that kind of reacts against the emerging church movement itself, but doesn't want the sort of standard thing because we're always sort of trying to strip away the institutional structures to get back to the original, is one of the central impulses, I think, of just evangelicalism generally. And there's a lot about that goes wrong, but it makes a piece like Sullivan's, which shares a lot of that sense of intuition. It gives a certain sort of familiarity to it.
Right. And that's interesting, because I think that, there was a study that came out last week too about the media's understanding of religion and its ability to cover religion stories. And I think that one of the findings of it was that a lot of reporters see religion as just, for lack of a better word, one big indistinguishable blob, right? Like that they don't see, they just see, oh, Christianity, that's the religious right.
Right.
Or, so it's very, it's viewed very homogenously by most reporters, and, they don't, but I think that that's partially a function of the same thing that's informing Sullivan, that, there are people who rise to prominence either because their institutions have the money to do that, or their institutions have the media outreach to do that, or they're on TV, or, there's a whole host of reasons beyond just personal charisma that lead religious figures to be the spokesperson for religion, right, or for their religion. So I think that maybe these things perhaps go hand in hand, that even somebody like Sullivan has a kind of narrow view of what's happening out there, because we all have a kind of narrow view of what's happening out there just because of the way our media culture is, that people with the best PR machines often get the most coverage, and that people who, some of the folks you're talking about might not even want media coverage. That might be antithetical to what they're even doing. It's not about getting on TV, and it's not about being on TV and getting your message out there, but rather, if I understand what you're saying correctly, more of creating a kind of intentional community that is what they see as a pure form of their faith.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I'm perpetually trying to make this point as someone who is both conservative, evangelical, politically conservative-ish, and theologically conservative-ish. I spend a lot of my time trying to say, not like those other folks over there, kind of like those other folks over there that you haven't heard of,
that you've never heard of, right?
But who are my people? It's tough to tell. Because I agree with a lot of the sort of standard religious right on most of the issues. Don't always agree in terms of the presentation or the arguments. But I think that homogenization, I think that plays out in a lot of different ways. From the standpoint of the church-state relationship, we tend to approach that question with a sort of homogenized understanding of the church as well, and treat all theological reasoning as the same, and sort of the same sort. And I'm not sure, just personally, that it works quite like that. I think it's very easy to homogenize religions and religious reasonings and say they're all of the same sort. But once you start peeling back the layers, I think you can, the church-state question, as it were, and the question of the politicized faith that Sullivan sort of railing against, and Jesus's political message gets a lot more tricky to unwind if you reject the homogenizing principle.
Right. But on the one hand, there are people who make the homogenizing, now that we're using that word, easy or possible. So, like, if you take somebody like David Barton, for example, who has very particular views that the separation of church and state is a myth, and that the founders never intended for there to be a separation of church and state. It was a creation of activist judges. in the 20th century. And because he's often put out there as a spokesperson of sorts for evangelicals, even though, for Sullivan, who's Catholic, and there's a Vatican, and there's the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and there are these entities that do have a claim to, setting doctrine. Whereas in evangelicalism, there are all the, like you said, there's all these different pieces of it and different movements within it. But when you look at somebody like Barton, he's often seen as a spokesperson for conservative Christianity and its views of the founding of the Republic and its views on church-state separation. And I think that evangelicals themselves, or the evangelicals who help promote Barton, have contributed to that homogenization by putting him out there as, he's our guy. He's our guy who knows everything about all this stuff.
Well, yeah, and that's where, the evangelical sort of anti-institutional impulse and the fracturing and the fractured movement means that the parachurch ministries and really the coalitions that arise get to define within the media landscape what it actually means to be an evangelical. And so if the religious right comes along and touts David Barton as their guy, well, that's just how someone like me is going to get identified in public. And that's just a function, I think, of this sort of lack of broader institutional structure that, like the Catholics have, or even the Episcopalians, or pick your sort of other Christian tradition. But that's just sort of part of what we signed up for, I think, in terms of our understanding of the church and the way it relates to Scripture.
But do you think, let's just take the title of Sullivan's piece. Do you think that there is a crisis? Do you think that the things that he talks about in the piece add up to a crisis in Christianity?
Well, I tend to be... so let me say this. Yes. I don't think anyone thinks that the ship is sort of sailing along without problems right now. I started a blog called Mere Orthodoxy 7 or 8 years ago, in part because I looked around and thought, what the world needs is mere orthodoxy. There's huge problems here, and the way forward is to recover this sort of classical Christian understanding as expressed by Lewis and Chesterton, because they seem like they had something going on, and the generation of Christians that produced those sort of figures had a depth and a vitality to it that our own religious world simply doesn't. Within Christianity, I think Ross Douthat makes a similar sort of argument in his forthcoming book. So I don't think anyone thinks that things are going well. At the same time, I would say part of the weirdness of being a Christian is we have this view of the church that it's sort of always declining and always being reborn simultaneously. And so for every sort of decline narrative that we can give, and evangelicals more than anyone love the decline narrative because it sells books and gets people to our conferences, and and it drives an entire world of apologetics ministries and save the youth ministries. So we love the decline narrative, but for every narrative like that, you can point to a lot of interesting and good stuff that's going on that makes me think, well, maybe it's not quite as bad as all that. And even if it's not as robust and vital as we might hope for optimally, I doubt it ever was.
I think that also, mixed in with that, and this is on the politicization question.
Yeah.
is that the religious right thrives on, as a political movement, thrives on a narrative that not just Christianity is in decline, but our entire culture is in decline, and that Christianity will save it. So that's sort of like this simultaneous, everything's falling apart, what's going to save it? We are, and that's why we need to evangelize more people, because if we do that, then this will fix these cultural problems.
Right.
And that itself seems to be a crisis, like a crisis narrative, right? Because we're constantly in a political or moral or cultural crisis. But that it might be a narrative that fuels a crisis, an actual crisis within Christianity, because it's politicizing the church in a way that has a negative impact on the culture and our democracy as a whole.
Right.
I mean, I think that that's part of the point that Sullivan was making, except I think he was making it in a more personal, religious or spiritual way. But it sort of seems like the crisis, in some ways, a crisis is essential to the religious rights narrative, even when they're having success. And is that something that troubles you as an evangelical? Do you want there to be something less crisis driven in this messaging?
Yeah, I mean, you're on the money about the broader cultural crisis driving, I think, a lot of the religious rights politics, and I have to be careful here because I do see things and think, yeah, that probably wouldn't have happened 50 years ago, and that does seem like a cultural decline. I mean, I saw Breitbart. I don't read Breitbart regularly or really at all, but someone on my Facebook feed linked to a story from Lifetime TV of, them showing children age 8 dancing in ways that I just thought were, I would never link to it because I actually think it's morally reprehensible the way the children were being sexualized. And I think, well, if that was happening 50 years ago, it certainly wasn't being broadcast on Lifetime TV. And being glossed over and the like. And so that cultural decline narrative, I think, well, maybe there is something to that. I think the frustration and Sullivan's point, and I think this is where a lot of people within evangelicalism, certainly people my age, the 30-ish age range within evangelicalism, completely agree with Sullivan that the solutions put forward have been disastrous for the evangelical witness because the solutions that have been put forward have been offered in these primarily political terms. And from that standpoint, I share some agreement with Sullivan and that line of thought. And I think it is a problem if our witness, if the first word of our witness is a legal one or even an educational one where we have to say something about the schools and the crisis going on in the schools, or if the word of our witness is something along political lines, then I think that we have gone awry.
So when you brought up this point, and I think that it gets discussed a lot without much resolution. And that point is that, the 30 and under, whatever, if you want to call it the Millennials or whatever generation you want to call it, that they're dissatisfied with the political strategy of the religious right, even though they remain committed to their faith. It's not a question of abandoning their faith. I think that Sullivan makes the point that the politicization of faith has led to more atheism, which can simultaneously be true with it hasn't negatively impacted young evangelicals' faith, but it may have negatively impacted their faith in politics.
Right.
But if that's true, if it's true that younger evangelicals of your generation are dissatisfied with the political turn that their faith has been given, wouldn't that mean that we'd see a decline in the political power of these religious right institutions that continue to make headlines, play a role in, say, keeping Rick Santorum in the presidential race because they think that he's the only true conservative left standing in the GOP field, for example? Or that, we continue to see opposition to same-sex marriage or the opposition to the Health and Human Services contraception mandate.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it's really sort of amusing. I think the New Republic earlier this year, or later last year at some point in this election cycle, wrote a piece along the lines of the religious right is dead, and then another piece, it's not dead yet.
Right, that was Michael Kazin wrote the original one, and Ed Kilgore wrote the response to that, right.
Yeah, and that seems to be the conversation that's had every 4 years.
Yes, definitely. But I think we've never had the conversation. I think the conversation started around maybe 2006, 2008, that the new generation of evangelicals, maybe people who were 18 or, voting for the first time in 2006 or 2008, were kind of, just tired of the old Jerry Falwell style of, politicized preacher.
Yeah.
And that's true.
It is true. And the question is, what are they actually tired of? So is it the actual political positions?
Or the style?
I think it's very clear that they're done with the style. The aesthetics of the traditional religious right simply don't resonate. Going to the Values Voter Summit and seeing the sort of weird fusion of patriotism and religiosity. That's not going to sit well with most evangelicals, I would say, who fit the sort of younger evangelical ethos that the media loves to talk about. But in terms of the positions, looking at sort of voting itself, by and large, the vast majority of even younger evangelicals, the millennials, if you will, still voted for McCain. And
right. I think there was a worry that they were going to vote for Obama.
Yeah.
During the 2008 campaign, I think that's what a lot of evangelical leaders worried about, that the younger generation was going to go for Obama. And there was that sort of notorious meeting Obama had in Chicago with some evangelical leaders, including Franklin Graham, and I think T.D. Jakes was there, and Stephen Strang, and Cameron Strang was there. And I think he's definitely one of these faces of this younger generation, and he publishes the magazine Relevant, which is geared towards that generation. And then the younger Strang, Cameron Strang, was supposed to give a benediction or some kind of prayer at the Democratic National Convention. I think decided not to.
Yeah.
Because I think from his public statements, I never talked to him about it, but I think his public statements were somewhere along the lines of, it's a little too political, or it might be viewed as endorsing the Democrats' position on abortion, or something like it kind of went too far. But I think that there was an element of, there was definitely a group of Democratic strategists and operatives who really hoped that sort of demographic of evangelicals would come over to the Democratic side, and they talked about they're concerned about issues other than, same-sex marriage and abortion. They're concerned about issues like the environment and poverty and war. And, these were all obviously were in 2008 and are in 2012 potent issues, but still you didn't see that migration.
Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, they were really the first Democratic presidential campaign to offer anything like that to younger or to evangelicals even generally. I mean, there just wasn't much of a faith outreach before that. And it's interesting. I mean, that has continued. Josh Dubois, the sort of the head of Obama's office on this, has, I think, done an extraordinary job of reaching out to a lot of evangelicals, those who are in the sort of more independently minded mode, who are frustrated. And even someone like Russell Moore, who is
and for people that don't know, Russell Moore is a southern Baptist theological.
Yeah, Southern
seminary.
Baptist.
Right.
He's dean, I think, at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is the
Right.
crown jewel of the movement. Someone you would sort of traditionally identify with all the sort of standard religious right issues, and it certainly is sort of against abortion, sort of, I think, conservative.
Also against the Values Voters Summit, if I recall.
Yeah. But he, I mean, like just last week, tweets that he met the president at the Easter prayer breakfast and was, I think, invited to meet them by Josh Dubois. And so these are the sorts of things that the president seems to be intent on reaching out to this demographic. And
but I wonder if it's, at this point, they have to have very granular polling data, I would think, right? So it's got to be, not that they think these people are going to vote for them, but do you think that it's more of a, let's try to diffuse some of that ugly rhetoric by just, being on very civil terms with these folks, even though we know they're not going to vote for us, even though we know that we have positions that are deal breakers for them. Why does that mean that we can't have the Easter prayer breakfast together? And do you think that even if it doesn't change the electoral equation, does it change a cultural equation in any way?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is where my political cynicism comes into play. Whether in this election or in some future election, I suspect that they're hoping it turns into votes for Democrats, and that they're sort of...
Yeah, I suspect that's right.
It's harder to vote against someone who you like as a person. It's also harder to just be really sort of contentious about someone who you've met and who you're on good terms with. And I think what really is different about sort of evangelicals my age in the 30-ish range is we will go anywhere and talk to anyone. And we're really interested in, I think, broadening that sense of conversation. And so we do end up in spaces that are a little more diverse, it seems like, from my limited vantage point, that are more diverse than those spaces in which our forebears ended up in. And that does make it more difficult to have a strident tone, if nothing else. I don't even know if we would be inclined to have a strident tone anyways, but certainly meeting people face to face and getting along with them and having good conversations with them makes the whole thing have a sort of gentler, softer feel about it.
Well, are there things, issues, setting aside the more civil conversation, which I think, who's going to argue with that, right?
Yeah.
But what are the issues on which you share with the more strident elder folks in the movement? What are the issues that you share with them that just make you pause and say, well, this is why I could never vote for Obama, or this is why I could never be a Democrat, or this is why I still feel like I have to keep the political side of the movement alive, even if I won't have the same optics as Jerry Falwell. I still agree on this, and this. Abortion.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, right? Yeah.
I mean, and you might just stop the list there. I mean, that would be enough if there was nothing else. But
is there something else?
Yeah, no, that's the question. Is there something else? I've written publicly defending traditional marriage, which makes me unique, I think, among people my age. Even if within this younger evangelical demographic that wants to be more independent and separate ourselves out from the excesses and the problems of the religious right, I have defended traditional marriage publicly. And we'll continue to do so until I'm persuaded otherwise.
So you do that publicly. Would you go to Iowa and campaign for the non-retention of judges who had voted for or who had, signed on to the opinion legalizing same-sex marriage in the state?
No, I personally wouldn't. Only because I think that's not quite my temperament. I've never been much of an activist.
Right.
I'm a theoretician through and through. So, when Sullivan, dismisses doctrinal claims and all of that sort of stuff, I just curl up and die inside. Because those doctrinal claims are to me just enormously important, because that's in part because I think they are really important, but also that's just where my tendency leads. But no, I think this is where one of the central differences that I have is the way these arguments get worked out in public, and the way in which the movement has operated publicly. So I tend to take a much longer view of things. I don't necessarily dismiss the sort of legal efforts that have gone on, and I think that those are interesting and important. And but I really think that if the religious right really does have the sort of commitment to traditional marriage and wants to see that sort of adopted socially over the long term, then the legal efforts are basically a Band-Aid. And it's a Band-Aid that I just increasingly think will be ripped off in 20, 30 years. And so you're saying that it needs, go for it. From your perspective, that it's more of a cultural evangelizing sort, that would lead people to think a certain way as opposed to imposing legal restrictions or legal restrictions or legal rules to change people's hearts and minds. It's kind of an interesting thing, because I think that generally speaking, evangelicals on the political stage are they say that they don't want government interference with things, or they don't want that the legal rules are required but less important than changing, what they call it, changing the culture. I don't know if you'd call it that. Yeah.
Kind of changing hearts and minds. Although they do use, the religious right does use the legal system quite a bit to try to change those rules.
Yeah, and some of that is, I think, a concession to an over-legalization culturally. I don't want to dismiss the role of law in changing hearts and minds, as it were. And I've written recently about how even while we ought to have this broader understanding, I think we ought still continue the work that has gone on within the legal sphere, while recognizing that the law itself as an institution, within our understanding of government and the government's relationship to society, it seems like we're over-legalized. And one of my favorite theologians, Oliver O'Donovan, basically puts it, within the modern world, making laws is a sign of government vitality. And that seems to be problematic within our understanding of the government generally. But given that we're there and that we do have this sort of overly robust legal positivism within our culture, I'm not sure that Christians can sort of avoid that or move out of that, even though one of the things that I would love for Christians to engage in long term is not just so this is where it's both sides for me, right? On the one hand, Christianity is in crisis, absolutely, which means for me the reformation of the church and the rehabilitation of Christianity within North America, which I've been trying to engage in. On the other hand, this legal positivism and this understanding of the state, I'm not sure it's quite as healthy as it might seem to be. It's certainly, it's robust, but potentially in a bloated way. And so, the conservative impulse would want to reform, I think, and rehabilitate both sides at once, because they do sort of go hand in hand, as it were.
Well, I guess the question for me is this. I think that there are groups like the American Center for Law and Justice or the Alliance Defense Fund, which view themselves as a conservative Christian antidote to the ACLU.
Yeah.
They're explicit about that. But they want, and there's a lot of litigation that goes on by those groups and some others that seems geared towards imposing a particular view of the Bible within the law. And that's very problematic if you want to preserve the separation of church and state, because while it's true that people's faith isn't separated from how they view political or legal questions, because, if you are informed by your own personal faith, of course, that's going to inform your views on things. But then the question is, and nobody, I don't think, is demanding that those two things be separated, that you walk into Congress or the Supreme Court or the public square anywhere and say, shed all that stuff that has to do with your religion and just, I don't think, I think it's a myth that anyone is demanding that. But then on the flip side, when you have these legal questions, so you have a legal question of, should we allow same-sex marriage? And if the answer is no, we should not because the Bible says it's wrong, then that can't be the acceptable legal answer, because somebody else is going to say the Bible doesn't say it's wrong. The Bible doesn't speak on it at all, which is, another view of the Bible,
right,
that it doesn't speak to these questions. And I don't think it's answered. I don't think that biblical question is answered by cutting certain verses out with an X-Acto blade, like Sullivan talks about Thomas Jefferson doing.
Right.
I think it's, the issue is that we live in a pluralistic and a religiously pluralistic society, and people have different views of those things. And so when you have the question of same-sex marriage or even abortion or any of these legal questions, if you live in this pluralistic society that has these different views of what the Bible means, then how do you say that the Bible says our law should say X?
Yeah. So there are certainly, I think, and, I don't know, so I'm not as familiar with how the Alliance Defense Fund and some of these others would go about making their arguments. There are certainly unsophisticated ways of saying these sorts of things in public. And I think one of the ways in which Christianity should behave in public is by trying in as much as possible to offer our arguments in sort of language that can be understood and accepted by anyone. However, the problem is that when Robert George and some of the Catholics who try to do this, the natural law tradition, when they try to make this happen, the rejoinder is basically, well, you're sneaking in your religious stuff all over the place, by and large, which seems to be...
He's not even sneaking it in. I think he's being pretty explicit about it.
Well, not if you ask him. He's not. I mean, what is...
That's true. I have asked him about it, and he does say... This is not a religious view. This is a natural law view.
It's a natural law view, and these goods are intelligible to, the goods of traditional marriage are intelligible to anyone. But the problem is if you don't share, if you don't share the sort of presuppositions behind even his view of nature, as it were, those arguments aren't going to seem forceful or persuasive to you. And so the rejoinder is, no, that just seems explicitly religious. But it's not for him. It's an understanding that philosophically, if you could eventually get to, if you sort of work through the whole argument. And I think you would also have to work through a lot of other arguments about the nature of ethics, the relationship between ethics and reality, which he has done elsewhere. I'm not sure that you can just read What is Marriage and be persuaded without reading a lot of his other work. You still may not be persuaded. A lot of people aren't. But
I think I do think it's a bit. It's a cop-out for him to say that it's not about religion, because, I mean, if you read the Manhattan Declaration, it is about religion, and it's about a demand that a certain view of religion be given a certain status in our society by our laws, and that if it isn't, then there will be civil disobedience. I mean, that's essentially the Manhattan Declaration in a nutshell, is that, well, if these laws don't take into account our religion, our being Catholic, conservative, evangelical, and a small number of Eastern Orthodox leaders who signed on to it,
right,
then we will engage in civil disobedience, and we won't. And I don't buy his argument that it's like King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Do you think that the Manhattan Declaration is a manifesto that younger evangelicals, that resonates with younger evangelicals?
Not broadly, no. At least not within the sort of younger evangelical class that we're discussing.
Right.
I would say, though, that from George's standpoint, I mean, so you could frame it this way, right? There's a philosophical argument that we can put forward that can be understood on its own terms. If in fact you don't buy this argument, it doesn't have implications just for society, but it has implications for all of these other religious organizations as well. And given that, then you have the sort of charges of civil disobedience, but the argument itself doesn't hinge upon. At least this is what George would say, I think, speaking for Robert George, tread lightly and tread carefully. But I would say, from my standpoint, it does seem like you could distinguish the arguments and say, here's an argument for traditional marriage that it was purely philosophical, accepted it on its own terms. If you don't accept it on its own terms, it has these other ramifications and implications for religious institutions. And that's why I do view the Manhattan Declaration as doing something a little bit different. It's aimed at a different audience.
And aimed at a different audience of... Who do you think the intended audience is?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's one of these rallying cries. Conservative evangelicals especially love manifestos and love signing on to things. And so as a conservative rallying cry, it seems like it's primarily an in-house audience meant to say, here's the place, dear conservative Christians. Here's the statement around which we will take our stand. And that's different than, I think, here are all the arguments that we're going to put forward for the particulars of the stand which we are taking, or even the way in which we're going to argue those things.
Right. Well, I once asked George, he gave a speech in which he talked about freedom of religion being the most essential freedom, because religion and spirituality and seeking of the truth and that quest for knowledge, for spiritual knowledge, is the most essential piece of what it is to be human. I'm, summarizing a 50-minute speech.
Yeah.
But he talked about this as being something essential to the dignity of the human person. That's his language.
Yeah.
And, essentially, basically, to paraphrase his language, essential to one's humanity.
Yeah.
So I asked him, well, if you think that, and you also think that marriage is very important to a person and to the happiness and fulfillment of a person, then why would you deprive gay and lesbian people of the right to be married and have that fulfillment of their human person? And he gave me his natural law argument against gay marriage.
Right.
And then when I said, well, that's your religious view. And he said, no, it's not a religious view, which is what you were saying. You were talking about this before.
Right.
He was saying that it's based in natural law, so therefore it's not his religious view, so it's not imposing his religious view to deprive gay people of the happiness of marriage, which he says is an essential institution to society and to happiness. So I think that, it's kind of 20 years ago, and even today there are people who make, just ugly arguments about, gay people are not real people, or they're Nazis in disguise, or whatever all of the horrible tropes are.
Right.
All the horrible anti-gay tropes. And this is like a new way of talking about it, but it seems to me that it's a tough argument to make in our current culture, where it's, even by George's fellow Catholics, legal same-sex marriage is accepted. And in every religious demographic except for evangelicals, there's a majority in favor of legalizing it. That doesn't deter you, I think, from your view, but it's got to inform an understanding that you're swimming against a cultural tide or even a legal tide.
Yeah, that's unquestionable, and I think it is absolutely unpopular. It's increasingly, I think, unpopular even within this younger demographic of evangelicals. We, I think, on the whole, are at least moving toward a position where we would like to separate the religious and the legal understandings altogether. I think there's a lot of naivety in terms of younger evangelicals and their optimism about how that will go for everyone.
So what do you mean? So you would let the legal end work itself out, no matter however it works itself out, and not fight it, and then the keep the flame alive, so to speak.
Yeah, that's the general. That's the growing consensus, I would say, among younger evangelicals is, let the legal do its thing. That's just sort of and it has to do with this sort of anti-politicization meme that Sullivan really picks up on, right? Given that we have over-politicized, well, what we ought to do is depoliticize the whole thing and just set up our religious understanding of marriage and hold to that within our religious communities, and within the structure of the state, let gays and lesbians marry and do what they want to do.
Right, and most of the laws that are being passed contain exemptions to ensure that no church would be forced to perform a ceremony if they didn't want to.
Right, but there's this other question about sort of how broad the religious exemption should go.
Right.
And, within, do hospitals count as a ministerial function of the church, such that the people who work in them would be covered, by these religious exemptions?
That would be a question of, would you have to let the spouse visit in a circumstance where only spouses were...
Yeah, or would you be covered by some sort of religious exemption within a Catholic household?
Do you think that these legalistic questions over these exemptions really are of interest to people? That's something I've been wondering a lot with the contraception stuff, right? Because it sort of seems like it gets down into this nitty-gritty of what's a ministerial exception, what constitutes church, and what constitutes actually paying for or participating in the insurance coverage. And it seems like there's got to be a limited number of people who actually find those fine-tuning those arguments interesting.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a limited number, but I think the force of those questions problematizes and makes difficult this sort of, well, just separate out the institutions and let each side do its thing, and why can't we all get along? And let's just all hug, which is, one of the sort of, if you're a younger evangelical who is reacting to the politicization of the religious right and is reacting to the hostility towards gays and lesbians that conservative evangelicals have become known for, and you want to reform and rehabilitate Christianity's witness in the public square, that's one of the most attractive options, is to dismiss all of these really tricky questions and say, why can't we just all hug? And that's where, while there are a limited number of people who are interested in these really fine-grained questions, I think we have to ask them, because they will come up, as we've seen. I think
evangelicals aren't really ready for the kumbaya moment.
No, on the whole, yeah. Broadly speaking, we're a long ways from kumbaya. The younger generation, I would say, is probably a few steps closer to the campfire than our parents are, and would like to be.
Well, I think we should probably continue this conversation another time.
Yeah.
And I think that I would love to continue the conversation to talk about economic issues and environmentalism and the teaching of evolution in schools and all these other issues that we never get to because we're always talking about abortion and same-sex marriage first.
Yeah.
But this has been really interesting, and I think we should probably do it again.
Yeah, I would love that. Thanks, Sarah. I really, really enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, we will do that.
Excellent.
Thanks. Bye.